Welcome to this deep dive, and today we're going to explore this really fascinating topic.
Yeah,
It's all about the respectful treatment of animal remains,
right.
especially in the context of museums.
Yeah.
And, we've got two articles that really kind of highlight just how important this is,
Yeah.
particularly, from the perspective of Indigenous communities. And
Right.
we're going to be learning from Chance Ward in these articles.
Yeah, Chance Ward's work is really important.
Yeah, he's a member of the Cheyenne River Sioux Tribe.
Right.
And he's really pushing for change in,
Hmm.
how museums even approach this.
Such a critical conversation right now.
Yeah. So get ready to kind of dive into this whole idea of living stewardship
Uh-huh.
and how we can honor that deep connection between Indigenous communities and animals, even after those animals have passed on.
I love that phrase, living stewardship. It really gets at this idea that,
Yeah.
museums aren't just these static places,
Hmm.
where objects are just kind of put on display and forgotten about.
Mm.
It's about an ongoing responsibility, an ongoing relationship.
Exactly.
Yeah, so it's a complex topic for sure.
Yeah.
And it really challenges us to rethink how we even view museums.
Right.
Not just as, repositories of objects, but as living spaces
Yeah.
where, these objects are treated with the respect that they deserve.
Right.
That respect that's really at the heart of it.
I think so.
Yeah.
And when I was reading these articles, it really kind of hit me. Like, one of the authors shares this really powerful story
Oh, yeah, I remember that one.
about finding horse remains,
Yeah.
just like haphazardly thrown into boxes.
Like just tossed in
Their
there.
bones all jumbled together.
No regard for the animal at all.
And it just made me think, like, wow, if that were a human ancestor, would it have been treated the same way?
Right. And that's exactly the point that Chance Ward is making in a lot of indigenous cultures.
Mm-hmm.
Animals aren't just objects or specimens.
Yeah.
They're seen as relatives,
Mm-hmm.
as members of a spiritual society. So the way their remains are treated has a profound impact on the living community.
And it's not just about the physical remains themselves.
Exactly. It's about something much deeper.
Yeah, and that's where I think this idea of living stewardship comes in.
Right. That's where it gets really interesting.
But I'm also kind of like, but what does that actually look like in a museum setting?
Yeah, it's a good question.
It sounds nice in theory,
Sure.
but I'm not sure I fully grasp how it translates into action.
I get that it's one thing to talk about respect,
Hmm.
but how do you actually put that into practice?
Right.
So living stewardship is all about recognizing that museums have responsibilities
Right.
that go beyond just preserving objects.
Okay.
It means actively engaging with communities,
Mhm.
and in this case, particularly indigenous communities,
Right.
to ensure that those objects are cared for in a way that aligns with their values
Yeah.
and their beliefs. It could mean changing how remains are stored, how they're displayed, or even whether they should be displayed at all.
So it's about shifting the power dynamic a little bit,
Yeah.
giving Indigenous communities a real voice
Absolutely.
in how their cultural heritage is treated.
It's about recognizing that they are the experts when it comes to their own heritage.
Yeah, and that's where I think this concept of cultural humility becomes really important.
Yes, cultural humility is crucial here.
And I think it goes way beyond just following the letter of the law,
Right, it's not just about checking boxes.
like Nabikure.
Exactly. NAGPR, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act,
Yeah.
that mandates the return of human remains and certain objects.
Right.
But it doesn't always cover animal remains.
Right. So cultural humility pushes museums to go further,
To go beyond the bare minimum.
to actively seek out and incorporate Indigenous knowledge and values.
Yeah, and that could be a real challenge for institutions that are used to being the authorities.
It's a humility thing.
It really is.
Yeah. And it makes me think about Jimmy Arterberry,
Oh, yeah, Jimmy Arterberry.
who's a tribal historian for the Comanche Nation. And he raises this really interesting point in one of the articles.
Yeah, what does he say?
He basically asks, if museums aren't going to care for animal remains properly, why keep them at all?
Ooh, that's a powerful question.
It is. It's a provocative question that really forces us to think about the ethics of holding on to these remains.
Without proper respect.
Yeah.
It's not enough for museums to just say, oh, we haven't always done things the right way.
Right.
They need to take concrete steps to change.
Yeah. And that starts with listening to the voices.
Exactly. Listening to the people who have been most affected by these practices.
Yeah.
And that's where I think this conversation gets really interesting.
For sure. Okay, so, if museums are really committed to this idea of living stewardship,
Right.
what are some of the practical steps they can actually take to kind of, make it a reality?
That's the million-dollar question, right?
Yeah, because I imagine it's more than just like putting a new label on a display case or something.
Oh, yeah, for sure. It requires a pretty fundamental shift in how museums operate, you know?
Okay.
One of the articles actually lays out like a roadmap
Oh, cool.
for how institutions can move toward more ethical and culturally informed care of animal remains.
So what does that roadmap look like?
Well, the first step is pretty straightforward, acknowledging that there's a problem. You know,
Okay.
a lot of museums, especially older institutions, they're dealing with what's called like a curation crisis.
A curation crisis?
Yeah, basically they have these huge backlogs of objects and specimens
Oh, wow.
that haven't been properly cataloged or documented. And that includes animal remains.
So they might not even know what they have.
Exactly. It can be really overwhelming.
Yeah.
But the article argues that even with limited resources,
Mm.
you know,
Mm.
museums can make progress by kind of prioritizing certain actions.
Okay.
And the first priority should always be communication.
Communication with who?
With indigenous communities, of course.
Right.
It seems obvious, but it's often overlooked, you know.
Yeah.
Museums need to reach out to tribal historic preservation offices, tribal leaders, elders, anyone who might have knowledge or insights about the animal remains
Okay.
that are in their collections.
So it's about building those relationships and making sure everyone's on the same page right from the start.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that indigenous communities have their own expertise
Yeah.
and knowledge systems that need to be respected
Right.
and incorporated into the museum's practices.
So once those lines of communication are open, what's next?
Well, then it's time to tackle that inventory and identification challenge. You know?
Right.
Figuring out what they have, where it came from, and what its cultural significance might be.
Oh, wow.
This could involve hiring specialists in zooarchaeology.
Zooarchaeology.
Yeah, the study animal remains from archaeological sites.
Oh, okay.
Or partnering with other institutions that have more expertise in this area.
It sounds like a massive undertaking,
It can be, yeah.
especially for museums that are already stretched thin.
Right. But the article emphasizes that it doesn't have to happen all at once.
Yeah.
You know, museums can start by prioritizing collections that are most likely to be of interest to indigenous communities.
Right.
And even small steps, like properly documenting a single box of remains, can make a big difference.
So it's about progress, not perfection.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's about making sure that those remains are not just physically accessible, but culturally accessible as well.
Okay.
That means thinking about how they're stored, handled, and displayed in a way that aligns with indigenous values and beliefs.
Right.
Like, for example, one thing that came up was the importance of avoiding storage methods
Okay.
that treat the remains as mere specimens, you know, like tossing them all in a plastic bag together.
Yeah, that makes me think back to that story about the horse remains.
Right.
It just seemed like there was such a lack of regard
Yeah.
for, the animals themselves and their cultural significance.
And that's precisely the kind of insensitivity that museums need to move away from. You know,
Yeah.
it's about seeing those remains not just as scientific specimens, but as ancestors, relatives, and members of a spiritual society.
Yeah, it's about a much deeper understanding
Absolutely.
of the meaning behind these objects.
It's about recognizing that these objects have a history,
Yeah.
a context, a story to tell.
Right, and that's where cultural humility comes in again.
Cultural humility is key.
Yeah.
Museums need to be open to learning from indigenous communities
Right.
about what respectful care actually looks like.
And it might not always align with traditional museum practices, right?
Exactly. It's not about imposing a one-size-fits-all solution.
Right.
It's about working together to find approaches that are specific to each community and their unique relationships
Right.
with the animal world.
It's about recognizing that diversity.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And one way to kind of formalize that collaboration
Okay.
is by developing like clear policies and procedures
Oh, interesting.
that guide the treatment of animal remains.
So you mean like a code of ethics specifically for dealing with these materials?
Yeah, something like that, but with the understanding that those policies need to be flexible
Right.
and adaptable.
Yeah.
You know,
Okay.
they should be developed in consultation with indigenous communities and reviewed regularly
Yeah.
to make sure they're still meeting everyone's needs.
It's not a one-time fix.
It's an ongoing conversation.
Yeah.
It's about constantly learning and adapting and making sure that everyone's voice is heard.
It sounds like a lot to juggle.
It is, but the potential benefits are enormous, you know.
Yeah.
By embracing these culturally informed care practices, museums can build stronger relationships
Yeah.
with indigenous communities, create more meaningful exhibits, and contribute to the preservation of vital cultural knowledge.
Right.
They can become spaces where everyone feels welcome and respected.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about theory and principles.
Yeah, a lot of big ideas.
But are there any, like, real-world examples?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Like museums doing this well?
There are some really inspiring examples out there.
Okay, cool. I'm curious to hear about those.
The Olson-Chubbuck bison case study that we mentioned earlier offers a really compelling example of how living stewardship
Okay.
can play out in practice.
So what makes this case study so special?
Well, for starters, the site itself is incredibly significant. It's an archaeological site in Colorado
Okay.
that contains the remains of over 200 bison that died around 11,000 years ago.
That's a lot of bison.
It is, and it's an incredibly important find
Yeah.
for understanding Paleo-Indian lifeways and cultures.
Right.
And for a long time, those remains were basically just stored in boxes
Oh, wow.
at the CU Museum of Natural History.
Okay.
But then the museum decided to undertake this major rehousing project, and they realized that this was an opportunity to do things differently.
So they reached out to Indigenous communities for input.
Exactly. They invited Lakota elders
Okay.
to visit the museum and offer their perspective
Yeah.
on how the bison skulls should be cared for.
And what do they say?
And this is where it gets really interesting.
The elders recommended keeping the skulls together as a herd.
As a herd.
Yeah.
Wow.
Which just beautifully reflects their worldview and the importance of community.
Yeah, that's an incredible detail.
It really is.
It really drives home this idea that these animals weren't just individuals, they were part of a larger whole.
Exactly. And it highlights the value of incorporating Indigenous knowledge into museum practices.
Yeah.
The museum took the elders' recommendation to heart,
Okay.
and they rehoused the bison skulls in a way that reflects that sense of community.
So it's not just about asking for input,
Right.
but actually acting on it
Exactly.
and letting it shape their approach.
It's about sharing authority
Yeah.
and recognizing that the museum doesn't have all the answers.
And in doing so, they created an exhibit that's not only scientifically informative, but also deeply respectful.
Right. It's a beautiful example of how science and culture can work together.
Yeah, it sounds like a really good model for other museums to follow. It is, and it shows that living stewardship isn't just some abstract ideal.
Right.
It can be a reality.
Yeah.
It just takes a willingness to listen, to learn, and to change.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's amazing to think about how one seemingly small detail,
Like this?
keeping those bison skulls together, can have such a profound impact
Yeah.
on how we even perceive those remains and connect with them.
It really is powerful. It speaks to the power of perspective,
Yeah. Yeah.
recognizing that there are many different ways of seeing and understanding the world.
And it makes you realize that something as seemingly simple as how we care for animal remains can have really far-reaching implications.
It really can, and it goes beyond just museums, too.
Oh, what do you mean?
Well, think about it, the principles we've been discussing.
How come?
Respect, responsibility, cultural humility.
Yeah.
Those are relevant in so many other contexts.
So it's not just about changing how museums operate,
Right.
but about changing how we think about our relationship with the natural world.
Exactly. If we start to see animals not just as resources or objects, but as beings with their own inherent value and their own cultural and spiritual significance, it changes everything.
It makes you think about how we treat animals in life as well.
Absolutely. And it raises all sorts of interesting questions. If animals are seen as relative, as members of a spiritual society, as Chance Ward put it, what responsibilities do we have to them?
Right.
How can we ensure that our actions actually reflect those responsibilities?
Those are really powerful questions.
They are.
And I think they're ones that each of us kind of needs to grapple with on a personal level.
It's not about finding easy answers.
Yeah.
It's about starting a conversation, being open to different perspectives.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground today.
We have.
I know I've learned a lot.
You too?
And I hope our listeners have too.
Yeah, it's been a fascinating discussion.
Yeah.
And I encourage everyone listening to keep exploring this topic.
Yeah.
There are so many resources available online and through organizations that are working to promote more ethical and culturally informed care of animal remains.
And if you're ever at a museum
right?
that has animal remains on display, take a moment to think about the stories those remains hold.
Yeah. Think about where they came from.
Yeah. And the communities they might be connected to.
Ask questions. Don't be afraid to challenge the status quo.
Yeah.
Museums are constantly evolving.
Right.
And it's through these kinds of conversations that we can help them become more inclusive and representative spaces.
Well, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of animal remains.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure.
And Indigenous perspectives, I think it's safe to say that we'll never look at a museum exhibit the same way again.
And that's a good thing.
Yeah.
It's through these kinds of critical reflections that we can create a more just and respectful world for all beings, both living and those who have passed on.
That's a perfect note to end on. Thanks again for joining us.
My pleasure.
We'll be back soon with another deep dive into a topic.
Yeah, looking forward to it.
That's sure to spark your curiosity and expand your understanding of the world.
Absolutely.
Until then, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep asking those tough questions.
Couldn't have said it better myself.